Right, good afternoon everyone. Something a little bit different today, just a quick sort of tutorial video I suppose. It's going to be relatively quick, maybe not that quick, maybe an hour or two, but just to show you some information regarding this new airport that's come up with the recent flight simulator update, the Nordic update. This is one of the airports in the northern coast of Iceland, Akureyri. I think it's pronounced, apologies about the pronunciation, but it's one of the new airports that's been included, and it's a new destination for a few airlines. There's a couple of airlines that are now got they've got seasonal flights. So EasyJet, I think, is one. Edelweiss is another. Iceland Air, I think, do seasonal flights here, and so does Transavia. So this is going to be an interesting airport to go to, and the reason it's going to be a little bit interesting is because it's a Cat C airport. So much like Madeira and Innsbruck, so Madeira, Innsbruck, Gibraltar, what's the others? A couple of others as well. You need special training to get in here and to land, specifically because there's an approach down this sort of valley, southern valley here. So it's a special airport. You need special training for it. And there's a few interesting things about this airport as well, which is certainly relevant if you come here, in just sort of extra things you need to think of, certainly with the approach, or the approach you can do, and getting out as well. So I'm trying to go through these things, try and go through sort of a few things in order, just talk about where the airport is to start with in relation to everything else, and then I'll just try and go through a few other things, just what we can sort of think about from a fuel planning point of view when we look at our flight plan. The approaches that are available. I'll probably start off by talking about the approaches and how we get in, and then potentially the departures as well. So it's an interesting one to go to. It's going to be an interesting one to stream, possibly, if I get a chance to do that. It's a lovely airport, so it'll be a lovely scenery. So I think it's obviously a new one for certain tourists, people that want to go sort of trekking around Iceland. Obviously, it's a very specific and lovely scenery, so something quite different to do. So hopefully this will be an interesting tutorial to go through, and hopefully it sort of provides some interesting information, and maybe just make this airport maybe a little bit easier to sort of operate to, if you can kind of sort of take on board some of the things that I suggest is done. So hopefully this will be quite interesting for you. Okay, so just in respect to where Akureyri is, we can see here we're sort of on the northern coast of Iceland. It's about 170 odd miles northeast of Keflavik. So there's a few other airports around which most airlines don't really operate out of, but Keflavik obviously being the main one. We can see this is obviously then sort of in the north of the Atlantic. So an interesting destination. MSA, if you needed to get down to Keflavik, we can see here the sort of largest is probably 9,000 feet. So yeah, 10,000 feet between Akureyri and Keflavik would probably be pretty safe if you need to divert somewhere. So first thing I wanted to do was effectively just look at the approaches that we can do to Akureyri, and I'll try and sort of run through some of the company notes, or the company that I work for. We've got some specific briefing topics, I suppose. So as we said, it's a Cat C airfield. We need to be specifically trained to come here. There's only really one approach that we can do onto runway 01, which is coming this way, and that's a localizer alpha approach, and I'll go through the various approaches in a second. But there's only really one that my airline's approved for anyway. The weather generally is mostly sort of southwesterly weather in terms of the winds. So the majority of the time, if you're flying here, you would probably only do, there's an ILS and an RMP approach that comes into runway 19 this way. So more often than not, you would probably come in and come this way in and land this way, which is probably a little bit easier. There's less to sort of think about, but I will try and cover both of the approaches. So in terms of the operating restrictions for us, it's authorised captains only. There wouldn't be any inexperienced crew coming here. The ILS to 01 is prohibited, which I'll come back to in a second. And obviously there's certain planning criteria you need to look at in terms of your fuel planning. There's a lot of terrain around. We can see that obviously lots of high hills and high valleys, so that's quite important to be well aware if you're at MSA. What else have we got? The Pappies. Interestingly enough, on runway 01, if you're landing on this runway, the Pappies on the right hand side are set to 5.3 degrees, and the Pappies on the left hand side are set to 3.5. Now, I don't think the simulator is quite capable of simulating that. The scenery I have here is I think it's the Gaia simulation scenery. That comes with the latest update. I did have the ST simulation scenery, which I did buy, but I do actually think this is maybe just a little bit better scenery. There's a couple of things missing, but I do think it's maybe just marginally better. Turbulence could be expected at this airfield, just probably due to the sort of the winds and the MSA and the sort of hills, and birds are generally a bit of a threat as well. So let's have a quick look at the approaches and what we can do, and let's just see if we can fly one. I will probably do the easier approach first, so we'll look at the approach on 19, because generally the wind is coming from this direction, from the south, so it's more likely we're going to be in this approach, and we'll just have a look at the approaches and how we would fly that. So let's have a quick look. So these are the approaches that are available for us. Let's have a look at runway 19 first. So this is an ILS. This is relatively straightforward. There's a few initial approach fixes that we come in from. Generally, if we're coming from the south, from Europe, we'd probably come up towards Arlax and then do the approach from here. Obviously, we consider it the MSA, and we'll just descend with the profile in accordance with the chart. The minimums are just on the separate charts here. So again, normally with the ILS, generally with two engines, you can always achieve the missed approach climb gradient, the highest one. So on two engines, it shouldn't be a problem at all. So CATC, our minimum in this case would be 710 feet, and the RVR we'd need would be 2.4 kilometers. There's an RMP Yankee approach, which we could also do if the ILS was out of service. We could potentially do this as well. Now we've got LPV minimums. Generally, most airlines aren't approved down to LPV minimums. That's localizer performance with vertical guidance. But most airlines aren't approved yet to do this. We can see the minimums are a little bit lower. So most airlines at the minute still use LNAV, VNAV minimums. And again, we can see the minimums for CATC aircraft, in this case, be 820 feet. So some airlines are starting to get the approval, so they will start going down to the low minimums if they do that. The other RMP approach is an RMP X-ray, but this is only for Cat A and B aircraft. Now the Airbus is Cat C, so we wouldn't be allowed to do this approach because this wouldn't apply to us. And equally, a TACAN approach. We don't have TACANs on our aircraft. This is military type equipment, so this is more of a military approach for the military jet, and it even says there for use by military air police and aircraft only. So this isn't really available for commercial aircraft. An NDB approach, most aircraft can do NDB approaches, so yes, we could do this as well if the ILS was out of service, and if we didn't have the equipment to do an RMP approach, then this would probably be then the sort of the last alternative we could use, which would be an NDB approach. So more often than not, or most likely, we'll do the ILS, and it's relatively straightforward. Glide slope is maybe a little bit steeper, so 3.45 degrees. So most likely you'd want to be a flat full landing for this because it's slightly steeper. And the other thing that is quite different about this is it's a little bit offset. So it's offset by a few degrees. So 185 degrees is the localizer bearing, but the actual runway is, if we can find it, 188, so we got 3 degrees difference there. So you can fly this down to your minimums, but then probably once you're visual with the airfield, you will probably want to then obviously land this manually anyway because it's not an auto land. But you'd probably want to then turn the bird on because you don't really want to be following any flight guidance really down to an offset localizer. So you'd probably turn the bird on, flight directors off, and then just land this with the bird. So that's a little bit of a gotcha with this because it's ever so slightly offset, and I'll sort of show you that in a second. The other thing we can see is quite unusual, but occasionally you see it in some places, shipping harbours, or ship in the harbour, or ships. could exceed 70 meters in height, so we've got to watch out for the ships, because there's probably cruise ships and stuff around here. So it's a relatively straightforward ILS, but it's got a couple of little gotchas. So let's go and have a quick look at this and just see if we can fly this approach relatively, sort of very straightforward. It'd be quite interesting to do. So let's go and have a look at that. Right, so here we go, guys. Let's have a quick look at this approach onto runway 19 then. So this one's a bit more the straightforward approach. Probably this is the sort of approach you're more likely to do as well with the sort of ambient weather conditions that we get up here in Akureyri. Most of the time the wind's coming from the south, so it's coming down this sort of valley here. So you're probably more likely to do an approach onto runway 19. However, if there are pretty still winds, you could do an approach onto runway 01. But obviously that's really going to be dependent upon you on the day and what the weather conditions are doing. So we can see here we're sort of direct RLAX now. This is probably the most likely sort of approach. Certainly if you're coming from the south from Europe, you're coming via RLAX and come around. We'll have a look at the chart in a second. And in terms of position, we're just sort of on the left-hand downwind here. Runway's just down here, the apron's here. So we're just coming down over the terrain and then coming down this sort of valley onto this approach here. So this one's a bit more straightforward. There's a couple of caveats to it. Just need to go through initially just a few sim-isms, I suppose. So the first thing I want to discuss really is just the approach, what it's called. You can see it's got a localizer runway 19 on the top of the ND there. And that's because there's obviously some labelling issue here. It's in the FMGC or in the Navigraph data as localised at runway 19. Now it isn't, it is actually an ILS, but there's no other approaches that you can select for runway 19 other than our nav approaches, TACANs. That seems to be pretty much it. So the only thing you can select is localised at runway 19, but we do know that the ILS indications are going to be displayed, excuse me. You can see a little magenta indication there. Indian Alpha Romeo is the identifier as well. So just a little bit of a labelling issue, so don't worry too much about that. So put it in as a localizer, but it is actually an ILS. We can have a look at the charts. If I drag that across, there we go. Hopefully we can see all of that. So this is the ILS, runway 19. Again, there's the RLAX. There's a couple of height constraints up here, so 6,000 feet at RLAX, 230 knots as well, and then 4,800 feet until we sort of pass this point, then 4,200 feet, 3,600 feet, and finally the platform's 2,500 feet. So we're going to look at doing this, maybe manage just to put it in the platform altitude 2,500 feet as the platform, and then just leaving the managed descent do its work. As long as we're sort of on profile and in the sort of right speed regime, then we should be pretty good. We should be doing the approach reasonably well. So in terms of how we're going to fly, it's just because do it relatively conservatively. I'm obviously going to be back below 230 knots, really about 180 knots to 160 knots on this base turn here, probably flap 2 at this point as well. And I'm going to arm the approach reasonably early, sort of on this base turn. The reason I'm going to do that is because the localizer indication doesn't seem to be perfectly aligned with the track on the ND. So the localizer actually just sort of is just slightly left of track when you're on it, really. So you pick up the RLS or the localizer just a little bit early, so it won't be flying this approach perfectly on the green line. So I'm just going to arm the approach just a little bit early, and we're just going to be a little bit slightly left of track when we're flying this. So that's the other sort of sim-ism. It's all still fine though. It's all still very safe. You're still sort of flying down this this sort of fjord here, I suppose is what you'd call it. So you're still well away from the terrain. But obviously just something to sort of consider. You're not going to be exactly on track. So that's not too much of an issue. Go on, Sim, wakey wakey. There we go. Excuse me, I'll have my coffee. What's the other things to consider? The fuel is obviously something you need to consider. As per the flight plan, we have Keflavik as our alternate. CNR to Keflavik is about 2.6 tons. We know it's about 170 odd miles away. In fact, if we put that in now, we can probably see just how far away it is. 156, yeah, not too bad. So 150 odd miles away from Akureyri. So we know the CNR is about 2.6. We're landing with about 4.2. We've got about another 45 minutes of extra fuel. So we've got enough fuel to give this another go. It's a lovely weather up here, we can see nice and clear. So there's probably little chance we're not going to get in. Obviously that doesn't excuse pilot cock-ups, etc., and just cocking up the approach, but there we do have enough fuel to get in for a second approach before we have to disappear. What else we got in? We've got India Alpha Romeo, that's the ILS, so at 3.5 degrees as well, so that's the other thing. It's a slightly steeper approach, 3.45 according to this, but yeah, about 3.5 degrees. Pappies are set to 3.5 as well. Minimums, it does say refer to the minimum chart, which is on this chart here. We can see the ILS. We're not doing a localizer only, we're doing an ILS. Now, normally with two engines, you can achieve the highest missed approach climb gradient, which obviously gives you your lowest minimums. So 710 feet for our case, 240 or 2,400 meters for the RVR. So we're going to put this in because we should be able to achieve this without any problems whatsoever with two engines. So 710 feet is the minimums. What else do I need to discuss? The other thing we want to look at is, can we get in? Now, the simulator doesn't really simulate contaminated conditions. It's probably, I mean, it looks pretty clear and dry, really. I'm sure it would be sort of with those sort of weather conditions. We're landing at just under 65 tons. So I've just done a quick landing distance calculation. A good landing runway condition, so it probably is dry, but just conservatively we put good. With the weather, 65 tons, Lord of brake and idle reverse with no failures, and we can see that the factored landing distance is still absolutely fine. We can land within the touchdown, we can land within the landing distance, so that's also fine as well. Obviously if it wasn't, we could look at medium order brake, which would be a little bit better. What else do I need to discuss? That's pretty much it, guys, really. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward approach. We're going to do this. We're going to see. I've done another little quick video just to sort of show you how offset it is. So that's it. That's how we're going to fly it. So when we're visual the runway, which we will be quite early on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect or disconnect the autopilot. I'm also going to deselect the flight directors and the ILS indications on the FCU. So all of this will be turned off. I'm going to go track FPA, and I'm going to fly this manually with the flight path vector with the bird. The reason I'm going to do this is because I'm going to turn the flight directors off, because the guidance is taking us to the left of the runway. So the actual localizer antenna, as we can actually see, it's a little bit offset here. So we don't want the guidance because it's not going to guide us down towards the runway. So I'm going to turn the flight directors off because they're basically going to become sort of, I don't know, unreliable, I suppose. So we're going to turn the flight directors off. We're going to check we've got auto thrust speed as well, and also the inbound QDM. Now the actual runway QDM magnetic heading, according to the chart, is, when we have a look at it, 188. There seems to be another little simism, I suppose, of this, where 188 degrees doesn't quite marry up exactly with the track on the PFD. I think it's because it's using grid at this sort of latitude. I'm not quite sure what's going on, but anyway, 186 degrees on the track seems to work quite well, so that's what we're going to use. So well, that's it, really. Again, pretty straightforward approach, this one, pretty much the standard ILS. The other little thing to think about on the go around as well, we've got maximum speeds, Cat C, 185 knots for this first waypoint. So we just want to be considerate of how we're going to fly the go around and what configuration. We can see S speed is 190 knots for this sort of weight. So we're probably just going to fly this flap 3 initially, because it's going to be a flap full landing. Flap 3 until we get past the first missed approach waypoint, and then we can start accelerating to 214 knots, which again is slightly below this. So it'll be flap 1 for this waypoint, and then we can start accelerating after that. So just be considerate of the sort of speeds on the go around. So there we are, we're sort of nicely settled now. So I'm just going to go flap 1, just start slowing us down. Again, 180 knots is kind of roughly where we want to be. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave this in managed descent. So I'm going to set the platform attitude and just make sure this actually flies this correctly. So we just want to make sure that the constraints are hit. We don't descend below them. Obviously we've got terrain. So don't forget to look out the window. It's very nice view, this very nice approach. So don't get too fixated on the PFD, but there we go. So above 6,000 RLAX, looks like we're doing that quite nicely. And then we're getting setting 2,500 feet. That's blue. We've got out blue as well, just because we should be hitting all these constraints quite nicely. So we shouldn't be going below these. So the managed descent mode is working reasonably well. So again, once I've done this, once you've seen this landing, the next thing I'll do is I'll just show you the approach. Doing the approach all the way down basically to sort of minimums, and then you can just sort of see how offset it is. It'll only take a minute or so, but you can just see the reason why. Don't really need speed brakes, do we? You can yeah, be able to see why we disconnect all the guidance on this approach, because we won't be following any guidance whatsoever once we're visual, of course. Obviously, if you're not visual, then you'd have to go around if you weren't visual at your minimums, which in this case is 710 feet. So yeah, it's above 6,000 RLX, that's good. So 4,800 feet or above that is the next waypoint. That's looking pretty good. So again, I'm just going to go flap 2. Seems to think we're on the profile, a little green dot there, which is our profile, so that's looking reasonably good. I'm just going to bring the speed back just a little bit. Again, this is a reasonably conservative approach, this one. We're not really rushing it too much. The other thing on the chart, it did say watch out for ships that are up to 70 metres, so we've got ships here in the harbour, so we want to sort of make sure we're well clear of them, which we will be. You can see the glide slope indication there, so even though it just say lock only on the FMGC, it is a glide slope, or it is an ILS approach that we're doing. So 4,800 feet, we're above that goods, which is fine. So at this point, this is where I'm just going to arm the approach, just because it's going to capture a little bit early. So we've got glide slope, lock blue, cat 3 dual AP 1 and 2. And hopefully this should just descend with the profile, and it should capture pretty much more or less everything as expected, just as we sort of pass this, this ridge here. I must admit, I'd love to come here, but I think the only flights we do are earlies, and I'm not an early person, so I'm not volunteering to do this just to get up at 6 in the morning. Just sounds far too much hard work. But it does look lovely. It does look a lovely approach to do. Certainly where the weather's nice anyway. So there we go. 4,200 feet is the next waypoint there. The 2 nautical mile waypoint, which I guess is 2 nautical miles from Ratham. So again, everything's looking nice. We're looking like we're on profile. And we should get a nice capture of all of them in a second. There we go. Glide slope, block star. Missed approach altitude, I think was 7,000. It says it up here. Missed approach 7,000 feet. There we go. So that's the missed approach altitude. So 7,000 feet is blue. That's about the scenery is looking gorgeous. This is about the 3rd time I've recorded this video. The last time I recorded it, I don't remember seeing these sort of textures. I think the Bing servers were down, so maybe that was some reason. But no, it's looking a lot better now actually. It's obviously, I think the Bing servers are working, but yeah, the scenery is looking very, very nice. Right, let's just slow it down a little bit. Who keeps binging me? Somebody on the Discord server. So you can see they were just a little bit left of track. This is what I mean. So the localizer isn't quite perfectly aligned with maybe the FMGC track, but you know, that's fine. It's okay. We can deal with it. The inbound track is 183. It says, or bearing. Yeah, but you can see we're in the valley. We're nice and visual, so terrain clearance is not a problem whatsoever. Right, so let's go manage speed. Let's try not to cock the landing up. Right, let's get the lights on. Just high workload situations. That's all done. That's done. I think that should have been on below.
2,500.
Radio temperature is checked. So you can see here we're pretty much perfectly aligned with the runway, which is quite nice. Got 2 reds, 2 whites. We've got a ship there we're going to avoid. And the localizer is just taking us just to the left. The localizer antenna is just to the left of the threshold, on the end of the runway down here. So if we just follow this, which we'll probably see in the next runway, we'd just end up going all the way to the left of the runway. Now, we don't want to follow this guidance because it's good for now, but it's going to become more unreliable the closer we get. So that's why we're going to start turning everything off. So let's get the gear down. Let's go flat 3. Flat full. Speed should be double checked. So VLS 134. That's looking pretty good. So VAP is good. So landing checks will obviously be done. So we can see now we're just drifting ever so slightly to the left of the runway. So I'm going to disconnect the autopilots, turn everything off, get the bird on. 186, that's the inbound track we want. We've got auto thrust speed as well, so now we've got everything's turned off in terms of guidance because we're not actually going to follow anything, and we're just going to fly this manually now just by looking out the runway. One thing we do still have, which is quite useful, the little green donut. This is basically our profile, so this is going to keep us more or less on profile, so we can sort of rely on that a little bit. It's not 100% reliable, of course, but it's going to do you a pretty decent job of just sort of maintaining you on that more or less 3-degree glide path. Of course, this is a 3.5-degree slope, so I think this is automatically set to 3 degrees. I can't remember. It's an FMGC geometric approach path, I think. But the easiest thing to do is just look out the window and then just follow the pappies. It's 1000's jets. So surface wind is about 130 at about 30, so there's a little bit of wind coming from the left, so that's going to blow us a little bit right. Still 3 whites, so still just a tiny little bit high.
100 above.
There we go, it's 2 reds, 2 whites. Don't mind being a tiny bit high, of course, because I don't want to drag my wheels through the funnel of that cruise ship there.
500.
500 stable, a little bit low.
$300. 200. 100. 50, 40, 30, 20. Retard.
Yeah, spoilers. First green. Decel. Wasn't quite as laggy as the last video I did. That's a lot better. I think, yeah, those Bing servers definitely weren't helping. 70 knots. So I'm not going to hammer the brakes to get off at the apron there. And then I don't think there was any particular notes about turning on the runway or any restrictions, so we're just going to do a nice 180-degree backtrack on the runway. So I don't know if you can just be able to see maybe in the distance, not quite. There's a localizer antenna up here somewhere. That's the localizer antenna for the approach that we've just done. Yeah, that's why it's a little bit offset. Obviously, relatively short taxi this as well. It's just time the engines. You want the 3 minutes for the cool down as well. So there we go. Usual sort of things after landing checks, everything that would all be done. So that's runway 19. So again, it's pretty straightforward, this one. And then we just park in here on the apron. Not too much of a challenging approach, a bit more straightforward, sort of standard ILS, just a couple of gotchas, certainly with the indications of, or the labelling of the approach, what it's called, is slightly sort of offset as well, just in terms of disconnecting all the automatics and the flight guidance as well, so that's the other thing you sort of want to do. But apart from that, it's a pretty straightforward approach. So let's just have a very quick look at the video, and I'll just fly the approach now, and I won't disconnect and land. You can just see the video of me following the localizer. You can just see how it would take us to the left of the runway, which is why you don't want to follow the guidance, because it just takes you over here, which is where the localizer antenna is, and that's why we turn everything off. And then once we've done that, we'll have a look at the approach to runway 01. So we'll have a quick look at the video first, and then we'll have the video of runway 19. And then we'll have a look at runway 01 as well. So there we go, that's runway 19 for you. Okay, here you can see the approach. You can just see how offset it is. So you can see that we're not aligned with the runway at all.
1,000.
So we're actually sort of heading towards a localizer antenna, which is sort of down here. It's offset. It's not behind the runway. It's actually just offset a little bit. But we can see the ships, and we can see this sort of how they sort of get up to 70 meters. So at this point, sort of minimums, you would want to be sort of disconnecting the autopilot, and then just landing visually. So this is where you disconnect. Turn the flight directors off. Set the inbound course 188 degrees. And then just landing manually on that. But we're not going to do that. We're just doing a go around and just give this another go. So ground flaps, flap 3, Antoga, SRS nav, positive climb, gear up. Right, okay guys, let's have a good look at the runway approach to runway 01 in fact. Is that in there? It's not in there. So the one we want to do is the localizer alpha to 01. That's the one we want to do, this one in here. So let's put that in. So let's head in track first. I'll just pause a minute just to give me a bit of time to go through this. There we go. Direct. Gear 2 done. Right, so yeah, let's have a quick look at the approaches. So we've got a number of approaches to 01 here. We've got ILS's, TACANs, ASR, and then this lock alpha approach, right, so the bottom, which is unspecified. And this is the only one we can really do, to be fair. It's the only one my airline's approved to do. So we can't do the ILS to 01 because the approach is too steep. So you can see it's a 5.3 degree glide slope, so we can't do that one, so that's no good to us. We can't do TACANs because that's for military and police aircraft only, so we can't do that. Localizer 01, yes, we potentially could be looking at that, but this is for CATS A and B aircraft only on this chart, so we can't do that one. And these ones, the ASR, which is an airport surveillance radar approach, a bit like an SRA approach, we're not approved to do this either, so I think this is an approach using surveillance radar which will help you sort of guide you down. So we can't do that one. So the only one we've got left is this localizer alpha, which is CATS C and D aircraft, and this is what we're going to do. So this is what we've got in the FMGC. The approach is via GIL 2, which again is most likely to be done from this, I'd imagine, if you're coming from the south from Europe or anybody else. So this is what we've got in the FMGC. Now this one's a bit more interesting to do. Now I probably wouldn't do this in the real world on a day like today because the weather's maybe, well, it's sort of southeasterly winds. At the minute the winds are 14011, so probably unlikely to do that. We're probably more likely to do the ILS approach onto runway 19 like we just saw, because it's probably going to be a bit more easier to do. Although the winds aren't too bad at this stage, so if you could do this one, because it's a bit more expeditious, doesn't burn quite as much fuel, then if the weather's fine to do it, then obviously this is one you can do. Now, again, a bit like the other runways, a couple of simisms which you need to consider. This is a localizer only approach. Now, annoyingly in the sim, when you still select a localizer only approach in the FMGC, it still displays glide path indications. So one thing you do want to do is deselect the glide slope indication of the transmitter in the failures, not because it's necessarily failed, but just because you wouldn't get it in real life. So of course we don't really want to be following that. We just want to have the localizer only. So we can go down here, ILS transmitter, glide slope. We just failed that, and now we at least know the indications on the glide slope won't appear, which is a lot more realistic and true to life. So that's one simism. The other simism, we have leading lights apparently in the real world. So leading lights refer to 10.9 alpha. If we look at 10.9 alpha on this chart here, we've got leading lights that project to about 7 kilometers south of the runway. Now again, the scenery doesn't have this annoyingly. I don't really know why, because I'm sure they could do it, but there's no leading lights here. There's only some rabbits at the start of the runway. So if the visibility was reasonably sort of low on this, what is the minimums you need out of interest? You need 2,400 meters. So, you know, if you had 5 kilometers of visibility, there might still be a chance that you don't actually see the runway when you need to at minimums. So that's another thing with simism, there isn't the lights there. The other simism, which we don't quite see, the PAPIs in real life, the ones on the left are set to 3.5 degrees and the ones on the right are set to 5.3 degrees. The ones on the right are set for the ILS, which we don't do. The ones on the left are set to 3.5 degrees, which is what we will be using. That we'll be following the ones on the left in real life. So when we see 2 reds, 2 whites on the left-hand PAPIs, we'd most likely see 4 reds on the whites. Now again, because it's the sim, it doesn't have the ability or capability to have 2 independent PAPIs. Now, you'd think they might be able to do that somehow. I'm sure they could create it somehow, just create a false runway maybe to the right of it and then set some more PAPIs for the runway that doesn't exist. I don't know. It's obviously a scenery developer thing, but you probably could do it somehow. But in the sim, you're only ever going to see the same indications on both sides. So when we're 2 reds, 2 whites on the left, there'd be 2 reds, 2 whites on the right as well. So that's the simism things. How are we going to fly this? This one's a little bit, it's not quite as steep, it's only 3.3 degrees, so it's not too bad, but because it's a localizer only approach, we're going to fly this in lock FPA. So we're going to arm the lock and we're going to turn the track FPA on, and we're going to follow the localizer down with the guidance. We're going to use the flight path angle in this window here, and we're going to set 3.3 degrees. Now we're going to set this when we get to our final descent point, which is this 11-mile point from the IEY or Fox Lima 01 waypoint, which is basically in the FMGC, so you can just about see it there. Fox Lima 01, that is our topper drop there, and that starts at 3,600 feet as per the chart. So we're going to configure this nice and early because we've got to sort of step down really. We've got to step down from 6,800 feet to 5,800 feet, then to 4,300, then to 3,600. So we want to be nice and configured before we do this, because there's not a lot of time really, there's not a lot of space to get down to these altitudes really. And we want to be really level at about 3,600 feet before the Fox Lima 01 waypoint, and then set 3.3 at about 0.3 miles away from this waypoint, and then we can start going down. And we're going to fly this approach basically all the way in flap 3 gear down, all the way down this slope until we get to our minimums. Now when we get to 1,350 feet, we're going to push VS0. So we're going to push this to level off at 1,250 feet, which is our minimums. And we're going to fly level at our minimums until we can pick up the PAPIs. Now, at 1,250 feet, we're already going to be low. We're going to be below the profile of the PAPIs. So there's going to be a level segment here, potentially, until we pick up the PAPIs, and then we can descend visually to land. So once we've picked up the PAPIs and the 2 reds, 2 whites, that's when we can go flat full. And in fact, there's no real necessity to go down to the minimums. When you've got a lovely day like you do today and the visibility is very, very good, you don't necessarily have to level off at minimums. You could actually level off a little bit earlier. So you could level off at maybe 1,500 feet and then just fly inbound, and when you're about, I don't know, sort of just under sort of 5 miles, that's probably when you're going to pick up the PAPIs. So you only really need to go down to minimums if the cloud base was very low. So if the cloud base was 1,400 feet, then you would probably have to do it. Or the visibility was closer to sort of, I don't know, 2,500 meters, then you might have to get to that sort of minimums and heights. But there's no necessity to. You could level off a little bit earlier, which is probably what we will do. So we probably will level off at about 1,500 feet, just to give us a bit more time to do everything. Once we are visual like before, we're going to turn all the guidance off, so the flight director's ILS, all of that's going to come off. We're going to get auto thrust speed and make sure we got a track F, we'll make sure we've got the inbounds at runway magnetic heading, which again is about 006, and that just accounts for, I think, any sort of grid differences with the headings. So that's kind of how we're going to fly it. So it's a bit more complicated, this one, and a bit more of a threat. That could be tailwind on the approach as well, so we do definitely need to be configured a little bit earlier. And again, there's just a few simisms where you want the localizer alpha approach to runway 01. You want to deselect the glide slope in the failures because we don't want to see any glide slope indication. And then very similar to the approach that we did on runway 19, it's just you need to deselect all the automation and the guidance and then just effectively fly this manually. What we do have as well, we do have some height checks here on the DME for the India Echo Yankee, and then we just double check that we're on the right profile. Now the rule of thumb, generally through 3 degrees, this is 3.3, so it doesn't quite apply, but the rule of thumb is for every 10 feet you are high, you adjust the flight path angle by 0.1 of a degree. So if we were at 9 miles and 3,000 feet, we are 2,900 feet, we would be 20 feet high. So we would adjust the flight path angle maybe by 0.2, so maybe by put 3.3, and that should get us back more or less on profile. Now that's sort of true on a 3-degree slope, not quite the same on a 3.3, so you do just have to fiddle with it a little bit and just try and make sure you're hitting these constraints reasonably well. But the other good thing, we're all visual with everything today, so it's less important. We just want to make sure we are obviously clear of the terrain. So let's have a crack at this approach. Let's just unpause it and try it. Now I'm a little bit high now and a little bit fast, so probably want to start slowing down and configuring. So we've got 6,800 blue, that's now checked. That's the platform, or the start of the approach at Gibraltar, and then we're going to start coming back on the speed. So let's go flat 1. Slow down to 180 knots. And instead of using the managed descent mode in this, I'm going to be more likely just using open descent mode between the constraints. And the reason I'm going to do that is just because it does seem to respond a little bit faster. It does seem to descend you a bit quicker than what managed descent would do. So that's kind of the plan, is just to do it that way, just because I think the management should be a little bit better. So as soon as we're clear of the approach, so we're going to arm the lock. Again, like before, we're going to keep an eye on the fuel, so we know that Keflavik is about 2.6. We're landing with about 4 tons. We should again have about 45 minutes of extra fuel. So that's all looking pretty good. What else did I need to say? I was going to say something else. Missed approach is a bit more straightforward. No speed constraints that I can see. 6,000 feet is the missed approach altitude on this one. So there we go, the next height, we're well above 6,800, so the next height now is 5,800. So that looks like it's getting us down there before the waypoint, which is good. Probably quite likely have terrain on in this instance. But we are visual, so again, terrain clearance effectively is all being maintained by the visual lookout. India Echo Yankee is identified, which is good. We've got lock blue. I think I've done everything down here. That's all activated. Let's turn the lights on. Been on below. So really what I want to be is sort of want to be roughly about VAP, maybe 140 knots or so, F speed, I'd say, flat 3 F speed. There we go, lock star. So we captured the localizer. You can see the runway just in the distance there. Just see the sort of leading lights. So yeah, we probably want to start slowing down and configuring as well. So yeah, probably around F speed, gear down the approach until we effectively level off at our minimums. So again, this is sort of approach a bit like Innsbruck, really. Just sort of take it nice and slow, nice and conservatively. There's no need to rush getting down on this. We can see we've got a bit of a tailwind here, maybe sort of, yeah, 15 knots tailwind. So it makes the approach a little bit harder because you're sort of battling against the tailwind to get down. So let's get the gear down. And then the next constraint is 4,300. So speed out start. So we've got thrust out at 4,300 blue. So flat 3. So this is the configuration we effectively want to be in, sort of gear down, flat 3, down this approach, and it's just nice and draggy then. There's just no problems with sort of maintaining speed, no real problems of sort of maintaining these height constraints, and we can just descend quite nicely on each little part, and then effectively we're just getting down to 3,600, which is our final platform altitude here. So again, a bit of a tailwind, which is not really helping things too much. But we are nice and visual, so again, everything else is looking pretty nice. This looks like a little bit of a runway strip there, doesn't it? Something. Right, next thing we want to do is put it into track FP8. So we've got speed out start. One thing you don't want to be doing really is flying level of flat 4 and gear down, because you don't really have enough performance to do that. So thrust out percent 3,600 blue. So next thing we need to do is 0.3 miles before this waypoint, we're now going to set 3.3, which is the approach path, or the approach angle. Again, just about visual the approach lights over there, so everything else is still looking pretty good. So it's about a mile before we start pulling the flight path angle. There you go, speed out start. And you can see here, because we've deselected the glide slope transmitter, we're not getting any glide slope indications, which is effectively what we're trying to achieve. Right, so there's 0.3. It's a little bit late pulling that. So we've got FPA 3.3, which is the approach, and we're going to set the missed approach altitude, which is 6,000 feet. So now we're just monitoring things. So we want to see at 10 miles, our first height constraint is 3,240 feet. Well, that's the sort of the height check that we're doing for the approach, just to make sure we're on profile. So 10 miles, 3,240. Yeah, we're pretty much bang on it. So 9 miles, 2,880. So we're just monitoring this. Again, it's looking like we're pretty much on profile. Again, 10 knot tailwinds, not really helping too much. So probably unlikely to do this approach in these sort of conditions, more likely to do the approach onto runway 01, but this probably is maybe a little bit more expeditious, and obviously would save a little bit of fuel. So 9 miles, so maybe about, so what's that, about 60 feet low maybe? So maybe just adjust that a couple, maybe just 0.3 initially.
2,500.
So radio altimeter's coming in, there we go, that's alive. So 8 miles, 2,520. Again, still a little bit low, so just shallowing this off a little bit, just because we are a little bit low on profile. And it's not too much of a problem because we are visual of everything, so we know that terrain clearance is pretty much assured. But we want to sort of maintain that profile as best we can. So 7 miles, again, just double checking every 2150. Again, maybe about 30 feet low, so again, just going to shallow this off a little bit again. So not too sure why we're descending a little bit faster than what we should. But that will probably do for the last one. So the 6 miles is 1790, and what we do is we're level off at about 1,500 feet until we got the pappies, and then we just land manually. So what did I say? 1790, 6 miles, so yeah, we're about there now. It's more or less on profile. So we're just going to level off there. Just going to disconnect everything, turn all the guidance off. Got all the thrust speed, 006 is the inbound. All we're doing now is we're just waiting to pick up the pappies, so maybe 1 white's there, just going to start visually manoeuvring the aircraft. 2 reds, 2 whites, so just going to set the landing attitude now, the approach attitude. We can go flat full, so speed check flat full, do the landing checks. And as before, the only thing to do now is to land the aircraft. So again, 10 knot tailwinds, so not ideal. I think everything else is done. Last minute paranoia, everything on the overhead looks good, so at the minimums we're happy to continue.
$1,000.
1,000's checked. And the other thing, we did a landing distance calculation for this approach because it's a bit more of a tailwind, so I've gone for medium order brake on this one. A little bit right at the centre line, just correcting.
500.
500 stable.
300. 200. 100. 50, 40, 30, 20, retard. 5.
Spoilers, first green, decel. This is 70 knots. And your brakes. There we go. So there's the approach onto runway 01. So again, it's not too bad. It's not that difficult to do, but you just have to think about how you're going to fly it, just how you're going to configure everything. It takes a little bit more thought. You have to configure a little bit earlier. You have to be considerate of the sort of descent path. And obviously, if you get things like tailwinds, probably quite unlikely to do it for tailwind. But you can see even with the sort of a 10 knot tailwind there, we weren't too bad. We could still actually get in. Come on. Turning around on the runway, however, is not the easiest. As before, time the taxi in, just make sure we got 3 minutes. So there we go, guys. That's the approach to runway 01. So that's hopefully relatively useful. Again, didn't really sort of discuss it on the brief, but did do a quick landing distance calculation with the weather. And we can see that medium order brake by reverse was still absolutely fine to land with the tailwind as well. So that was the other thing you needed to consider as well. But everything else remains the same. Looking at the fuel, all the rest of it, that's all absolutely fine. So hopefully that's reasonably useful for those two approaches, or to look at those two, just sort of roughly how we would do that in the real life. Now again, I add the caveat, I'm not actually trained to come here, so I'm not sure if they're 100% realistic to the real world procedures. It's probably very, very similar, but they're probably not exactly the same. But that's what we're approved in my airline. We're approved to do that Firewire Alpha approach to 01. We're not allowed to do the glide slope or the ILS because it's a steeper approach. We're not allowed to do the TACANs, obviously, or the SRA or the ASR ones, the airport surveillance radar. We're not approved to do that. So that's the only approach we can do onto 01, which is why I demonstrated that one. And obviously the ILS onto runway 19 was a bit more straightforward as well. But hopefully that's pretty useful. I'm going to have a quick look at the departure as well, the departure off runway 19, because I think that's important to look at as well, because that's, even though it's relatively straightforward, there's a couple of caveats to it in terms of what you need to do. So the final sort of video we'll just have a quick look at, we'll just have a look at the departures to runway 19. So let's have a quick look at those in a second. Right guys, let's have a quick look at the departures, just because this will be quite interesting just to look at, especially off runway 19 like we're doing now. So again, looking at the weather, most of the sort of typical sort of weather conditions that we find in Akureyri, it's usually southerly winds, so it's more likely you're going to do this sort of departure rather than depart off runway 01. So this is probably a little bit more likely, and this departure is a bit more interesting. A few extra things just to consider as well. So let's have a quick look at the departures that we've got. So these are the SIDs. So if you're going to depart off 01, there's only a couple of departures you can actually do, and that's the Akureyri 2 Alpha, 2 Bravo, and 1 Alpha departure. It's only a choice of these two here. So you can pick one of these if you're departing off 01. The reason you can't do any of the others is because they're for Cat A and B aircraft only. So you can't do this departure, you can't do that departure, and I don't think you can do this departure either. So there's only a couple there. If you're going to depart off runway 19, there's a few others you can use. So you can use a Jarry 1 Charlie or Asker, it depends which way you're going. If you're going to the south, back to Europe, it's probably a Jarry departure. So you could use this one. This one's got a slightly lower climb gradient required, 5.8%. So this one's a little less restrictive. In terms of performance, there's also a Jarry 1 Delta. This is the one that I've chosen. It's a slightly higher climb gradient, it's 8.1%, but if you're doing that, then what you've got to do, sort of 492. So yeah, probably somewhere in between 1,500 feet a minute rate of climb you would need to be able to do if you're doing this, which 2 engines you should be able to do that without any problems at all. And then the other one, the Jarry 1 Echo, again, you could do this. This is just the conventional departure. So this is just using the conventional radio beacons. So more than likely you would probably do the Jarry 1 Delta, which is what I've got. There's no stop altitude on this, so I'd probably assume it would be maybe a flight level, something flight level 150, 160, ATC would give you that on the clearance. So that's all done. So the departure is relatively straightforward in that respect. You just need a decent climb gradient, which again you should be able to do 2 engines. The other thing you want to sort of look at is if there's any takeoff weight restrictions. So I've put the sort of the rough sort of takeoff weight 70 tons with the METAR, and I've gone toga as well with this. So I don't think there's any restrictions to do flex. I think you can do a flex departure. There's nothing in our notes to say you can't. However, due to the terrain off to the south, I'm basically electing to go a toga takeoff because I think it's a bit like Innsbruck. You probably want as much power as you can early on. So even though there doesn't seem to be any restrictions on a toga takeoff, in terms of it's mandatory, I'm going to go toga anyway, just to obviously it's the more conservative and safer thing to do. Now with that, you can look at the regulated takeoff weight. So we've got 82.2 tons. I think these figures are maybe a little bit optimistic. I've run this through FlySmart for the 320 CEOs, and it's suggesting maybe a takeoff weight of about 76 tons as your maximum takeoff weight. But I've got a flight plan into Heathrow here. The sort of the plug fuel suggested about 9 tons, and we've taken about an extra ton of that, so we're taking about 10 tons anyway, which gives us a takeoff weight of about 70.5 tons as well. So that would be well below the restriction either on the FB here, or probably more likely sort of FlySmart would be maybe suggesting 76 tons. It's well below that as well. So it doesn't seem to be any restrictions on the takeoff weight, fortunately, which is quite nice. The other thing you want to do if you obviously are looking at the weight is could you return. So if you did have some major problem, maybe had a medical emergency or something, you needed to come back into Akureyri really quickly, and the aircraft is fine, you want to see if you can land. Obviously we are taking off above sort of max landing weight here, so max landing weight is probably in the region of 320, 66 tons, is it? So I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but probably above max landing weight. So you want to see if we are landing about 70 tons, can we still get in? And we can see on a runway condition of 5, which is probably likely what it's going to be with the METAR, 70 tons with max manual brake and max reverse, we could still land. So that's the other thing we just sort of want to consider on runways like this is can we get in, because the next available runway to land on is probably Keflavik, and we know that's probably about 150 odd miles away. So that's the other thing we need to look at. One of the other things we want to sort of be considerate of is the emergencies. Now I have tried to do or simulate an engine failure to simulate the emergency procedures here. Unfortunately the Phoenix doesn't really simulate the single engine performance very well, so unfortunately if I was to do an engine failure here, there's probably a very good chance I just wouldn't climb at all, which would kind of make the whole sort of exercise pointless, because you do still get climb performance even at these sort of weights. So I can't really demonstrate the emergency procedures, but we can have a quick look at them at least. And of course I've got the thrust reduction acceleration document that a lot of us will probably know about, and we can see the engine out procedures here. Off runway 01, it's both of them are non-standard, and they basically sort of turn towards a couple of NDBs and then they end up holding at the Alfa Romeo NDB. Off runway 19, again it's very similar. Straight ahead to 2.7, then a right hand turn to the Tango Oscar NDB, and then at the Tango Oscar NDB it's direct to the November Bravo NDB, and then once we get to November Bravo or 4,800 feet, whatever comes first, it's a left hand turn back to the Alfa Romeo. Now this is essentially the conventional departure. This is essentially this, so the sort of Jarry 1 Echo, so it's basically that, then the Tango Oscar, and then maybe a slight abbreviation at the start here. So that's all I've put in the secondary, is I've just put that departure in. the Jerry sort of 1 Echo, because that's more or less what it would be, and you would just follow that and just follow the NDBs. And of course you can hard tune the NDBs, Tango Oscar, November Bravo, etc, etc. You could do all of that if you want, but I'm not going to simulate the actual emergency procedures because, as I said, the single engine performance for the Phoenix just isn't quite correct, so it's a little bit superfluous for me to sort of demonstrate it. But that's kind of what you would set up, at least, to maybe a couple of hard tune, a couple of NDBs, etc, and discuss it. Now the other thing that's interesting about this departure is the higher engine acceleration altitudes. So because of the terrain to the south, we've got much higher engine acceleration altitudes of 5,011 feet. Now for those of you that are relatively au fait with the SOPs, know the SOPs, whenever you see higher engine acceleration altitudes, these engine accelerations in red, the thrust reduction acceleration altitude also has to be the same. So it always has to be the same as the engine acceleration altitude. So we've had to amend those in the FMGC, which is what we've done. So we can see here we've overwritten the normal thrust reduction acceleration altitudes and made those to 5,000 feet. So what we're going to do is we're going to climb all the way to 5,000 feet before we start accelerating. So that's basically the plan, and that obviously gives us the takeoff performance to then effectively clear all these hills, which is effectively what we're trying to do. Now, the other thing which I've noticed with this, because I've demonstrated this or tried this before, and I did notice a slight annoyance, really, and there's nothing in our brief to suggest we do this, so I'm not 100% sure if this is done in real life. I would assume it maybe is. I don't have the training brief to this airfield, unfortunately, so I don't exactly know what they're doing, but it would make sense if they do this, and this is to put the AP on for departure. So I've left it on. So it's normally a packs off takeoff anyway, so we're going to at least stick to that, so packs off takeoff. But when you pass about 3,000 feet on the barometric altitude, if you haven't turned the packs on, you will get an ECAM caution to say the packs are off, effectively, because you're not pressurising the aircraft. So, you know, pretty good system to warn you that you're not actually pressurising the aircraft, and you know, you obviously don't want that because the cabin altitude is going to keep increasing. So to mitigate the unwanted spurious pack ECAM cautions, I'm going to leave the the APU on, and then at about 1,000 feet I'm going to turn the APU bleed on, and then I'm going to have the packs running off the APU bleed. Very similar to what we were doing in Innsbruck. So what I don't want to do is forget about the packs, so I'm going to have the packs running off the APU. Where's the bleed? There we go. So the bleed will come on from the APU, and then that will supply the packs. So then we're not changing the thrust for the engines. The engines are still maintaining their normal thrust, toga thrust. And then once we're safely above the MSA, probably about 10,000 feet, we can start reconfiguring the pneumatic system and start turning a pack off and the APU bleed off, and then start getting the packs to come off the engines as they were normally. Obviously, the limitation for a dual pack operation off the APU is 15,000 feet. So we want to sort of do this roughly before 15,000 feet. So again, I haven't seen anything written to suggest that this is done in the real life, but if they don't do that, they're going to get sort of spurious ECAM cautions, which I don't really think they want to do. So I would imagine they're probably going to do something very, very similar and just depart the APU on, and then just have the bleed on maybe after about 1,000 feet, and then just have the packs coming off the APU bleed. That would seem to make sense to me, and it would just mitigate any unwanted spurious pack ECAM cautions coming up. So that's the other thing which I'm going to do slightly differently, which again, it isn't really written anywhere, but I'm going to do it anyway because it seems to make sense. So that's the sort of slight maybe SOP differences. Which, I'm going to do a toga takeoff just because I think it's safer. I'm going to have the APU on, and the packs can come off the APU as well, so that's the two different things. We've discussed the higher thrust reduction acceleration altitude. We've discussed the sort of regulated takeoff weight, if there is any. And we've discussed the emergencies as well. So that's more or less it, I think, for the departure. Again, it's relatively straightforward if you just sort of stick to those few differences. Runway 101, the departure of 01 is a bit more straightforward. It just goes straight down the valley down there, and it turns right. So a lot less restricted off runway 01, which is why we're demonstrating this departure off runway 19, because it's more likely the departure you would do given the sort of weather conditions. Again, the weather conditions at the minute about 140 degrees at 11 knots, is it, I think? Yeah, 140 at 11. So you would probably likely do this departure in real life because it's a little bit more in the direction of where you're going, and the performance is probably better because you've got more of a headwind. So there we go, guys. That's pretty much it. I'm not, as I said, I'm not going to demonstrate any emergencies or something. because unfortunately the Phoenix doesn't really simulate that very well. So we're just going to do this departure and just sort of climb up to about sort of 25,000 feet, as we would normally. There's a half a route into Heathrow. This is sort of Keflavik to Heathrow, so it's going to be something along these lines, back to Europe effectively. So there we go. I think that's done. We're going to assume all the checks are done. I think everything else, quick paranoia check over the overhead. That's all looking good. Lights are on. That's good. Let's just double check this. There we go. Ecam's looking good. Everything else is done. There we go. So yeah, that's it. Enjoy the departure. I will try and get a few different views in. I don't think I need to discuss much else. I will talk about a few things as I'm doing them. But in the meantime, just enjoy the rest of the flight. This man, Tiger SRS, auto thrust, blue. Knots. V1. Rotates. Fast climb. Gear up. Nav. AP1. So you want to watch your toga limit, so it's 5 minutes, 2 engines. So we've obviously got toga up to 5,000 feet at the time being. So 5 minutes would be your limit on 2 engine operation. But you're going to get to 5,000 feet reasonably quickly, and we can see that we're well above the 1,500 foot rate of climb that we need for the climb gradients. Again, lovely views out the window. So yeah, very, very nice place to come to, I'm sure. Just not entirely sure I want to go for the hassle of being trained to go here, especially if they do early flights. I don't work very well on earlies. But yeah, beautiful scenery. Right, let's get the APU bleed on. So we'll probably get an ECAM in a second. So bleed's on. Let's get back one on. And back 2. So that just mitigates any unwanted pack ECAM cautions coming up. Probably should have done that a bit earlier, but I seem to have at least avoided the ECAMs. There's a speed restriction as well. This first waypoint up here, 230 knots. Because we're well below the 205 knots, the first waypoint. So that's the other thing we want to just consider, 230 knots. But we should be accelerating at about more or less the same sort of time that we get there. We know green dot's 225 as well, so we should be below that. So there's 5,000 feet. So saying, leave a climb. So we've got thrust climb, climb. We start accelerating away. Set standard. Standard set and cross check. We've got flight level 160 blue. And beautiful views. Very, very nice place to come into. So this will make a very, very nice stream when I do it, which I probably will try and do this week if I can. Something a little bit different. So let's pass an airspeed, flap 0, speed check flap 0. Get rid of the lights. As you can see, we're just about getting to this waypoint here at 230 knots. And we're just going to pass it shortly after. So we're not really at this speed for very long. And then we'll accelerate up to 250 knots as per normal. If you were slightly heavier, you might just want to say flap 1 until you pass this. You can understand why why Iceland and people come for the scenery. One of our dog walking friends, her son is going to Iceland to surf, of all places. I mean, yes. Right, a bit of anti-ice, come on, so we're going through the clouds. Nuts. I think the guy's, he's certifiable if he wants to go and surf in Iceland, but apparently it's quite popular, but each to their own. Sounds a little bit cold to me. Right, so we're climbing away now, so we should be nicely above the MSA now. We're sort of visual in most of it as well, which is good. We're sort of flying into the sun. But everything else is looking pretty good. The aircraft's pretty much all good again. So we can start looking at maybe configuring the bleed system. So we can see there now on the layer SD page that the APU is supplying that the packs, which is kind of what we wanted to do. But now we're above the MSA, engines are all performing normally, and before we get to flight level 150 we want to start reconfiguring this back to normal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn a pack off, and then turn the APU bleed off. So now we've got engine 1 will be supplying pack 1. The cross bleed valve would normally open automatically, I think. There we go, engine 1 is supplying pack 1. Is he going to do it? Probably not. No. Oh well, there we go. Then we can put pack 2 back on, and now engine 2 is now supplying pack. So engine 2 is supplying pack 2 again. So we've got the sort of bleed system all back to normal, and we no longer need the APU. So now we can turn the APU off, and then that would just do its sort of 2-minute cooldown cycle, and then that will sort of shut down in the next couple of minutes. So there we go, that's it. I think we're out of the clouds. I think the anti-ice can come off. We can release the crew. They can do about their business. And away we go. We can go back to the UK. The MSA, that's on. Airports are on. That's done. That's all done. Guard would be on 2. We'd double check that. 33,000 feet. Yeah, maybe I'd squeeze up to 35 if we needed to. That's done. Secondary's copied. And away we go. So there we go, guys. That's the departure off runway 19. Again, reasonably simple if you know what you're doing. There's a few differences there, just changing the thrust reduction acceleration altitude. Toga takeoff, yeah, I haven't written anything to say you have to do it, but maybe makes sense to do a toga takeoff. Again, it's just slightly sort of more conservative, gives you a bit more performance. It's obviously a little bit safer. So yeah, maybe a toga takeoff. The emergencies, yeah, I don't know why you're flashing away. Emergencies are obviously a little bit non-standard as well. If the engine, or if the aircraft was light enough, single engine performance might be okay. But unfortunately, the Phoenix doesn't quite model the single engine performance really well enough. It's flight level 330. So I can't really demonstrate any emergencies, annoyingly. I don't know why the train's on standby. I don't know. Train's on standby for some reason. Obviously, it doesn't quite know where it is. That's fine. We know where we are, so that's the main thing. And there we go. So that's it. So hopefully that's Akureyri in a nutshell. So just to recap, sort of looked at kind of where it was in location to everything else, where it was in location to places like Keflavik. We've looked at a couple of the arrivals. So probably the arrival you'd most likely do on runway 19, which is the ILS, even though it says the localizer in the FMGC. We looked at the localizer alpha approach to runway 101, because that's pretty much all we're approved to do at the minute. So just how we would fly that, configure it and land, and a few sort of sim differences on that one. And then we looked at the departure off runway 19 as well, which is more likely the most likely departure you would probably do, certainly if you're flying back towards the south, back to sort of the UK or Europe, sort of over there somewhere. So that's it, guys, really. There's not really much else to discuss. It's a new route for a few airlines, so it's an interesting one to go to. A few threats, a few things that you need to consider. Obviously, it's Cat C again, so real life, the captain's obviously trained to go here, and they're trained to go here because some of the procedures are just ever so slightly different to what they normally are, which is why we're sort of trained, well, not me, but why other captains are trained to go there. So there we go. I hope that's useful. Hope that sort of covers a few other things which some people haven't looked at. Again, hopefully it clears up a few things. Again, I've sort of seen a few people that have gone into this sort of place on streams, and you know, without being rude to them, I'm not sort of criticising, but yeah, they just don't really know what they're doing. But why would they? They're not. I don't think they're real world pilots. They don't have access to the same information that I have access to, and hopefully it just clarify a few things and just show you sort of what we'd probably more likely do in the real life sort of situation. And again, I just have the caveat, I'm not trained here, so it's only a sort of best guess assumption from my part for the time being, but it's probably about as close as you're going to get to the real world procedures. So hopefully that's pretty good. That's it for me. I will try and stream when I can for the rest of the week. Got a few days off, which is quite nice, and hopefully see you guys soon. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of the week. Cheerio.